Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Let me pin myself so that you can record this without anyone getting uncomfortable. Okie dokes. Welcome everyone to the Shiur. I'm going to wait 1 minute as we always do for people who are joining late. Tonight's Shiur will be about Mishloach Manot, and it's going to be about Lamdas again. And those of you who came to the first Lamdas Shiur, you'll find a lot of similar patterns. Those who didn't, be repeating why Lamdas is so important, what Lamdas is about, how Lamdas tries to take details and turn details into concepts. And once we turn details into concepts, we can then spread those concepts to other details that seem to be unrelated, but are really related. That's why I call Lamdas the hidden glue of Shas. Shas seems like unrelated details, having nothing to do with one another. All of a sudden, you train your mind to see details as reflective as a broader category, and all of a sudden, you can link Shas together. What is Kiddushin? What is Kinyan? What is Hektish? What is Nidarim? And link all the halachas and see them as different models. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to talk about the halacha of Mishloach Manos Ishlarei tonight. Okay, let me just get the share up so you can see the Makaris list. Okay. How many mitzvahs are there? Feel free to open your mics. How many mitzvahs are there in Purim?
4.
4. What are they, Azi? Very good.
There's Matanel Avyonim, Mishloach Manot, Megillah, and wait a second. And Mishteh. Suda.
Sudas Purim. Excellent. Now, it's always important when you start learning to establish an intuitive approach, because then you can realize when a Rishon says something which isn't intuitive. So you can't understand the Chiddush until you understand what the assumption would be without the Chiddush. So if I asked you, which mitzvah would you compare Mishloach Manos to structurally? Which mitzvah is it most like? Answer someone? Okay, I'll answer the question for you. Intuitively, I would say it's like Matanos Levionim. You're giving gifts to someone. The differences are minor. The differences are technical. Mishloach Manos are giving food. Matanos Levionim are giving money. Matanos Levionim are giving to poor people. Mishloach Manos is giving to anyone. Matanos Levionim are giving to 2 different people. Mishloach Manos is giving to 1 person. Okay, this, that, the other, but you're basically talking about the same type of mitzvah. It's built the same way. We're going to see that may not be true. And the first Rishon we're going to see is the Rambam. Take a look at the Rambam. I'll share the screen with you. The Rambam, when he describes the Suda, this is in Hilchos Megillah B'Chanukah, Perek Beis. Ketzad, look at my cursor. Ketzad Chovas Suda Zu. How should you conduct Sudas Purim, Azi? Yochal Basar, eat meat. Yisakin Suda Na Kafir Shatim Sayado. Spend as much money as you can. Drink wine until you fall asleep. The Rambam says no mitzvah to get drunk. Drink wine and fall asleep because you're a little tipsy. Okay, you ready? V'chein chayev adam l'shloach shtei manos shel basar. Also, you're chayev to send 2 manos. 2 chidushim in the Rambam. Number 1, organizationally, he puts the halacha of Mishloach Manos right in the middle of the halachas of Suda. The Rambam was very meticulous about how he cataloged the halachas. And here he inserts and embeds the halacha of Mishloach Manos right in the middle of Suda. Second Chiddush, see this word v'chein? Make it bigger for you. That's called a bridge word. The Rambam starts by describing the Suda, and he says v'chein, and also you should send Mishloach Manos. What do you see from the Rambam? Anyone want to tell me from the Rambam? Mishloach Manos is not a separate mitzvah similar to Matanos Avyonim. Can anyone tell me what the Chiddush in the Rambam is? The definition, the category Mishloach Manos is? Anyone? By placing into
Or the
the
mitzvah of Su'uda.
Very good. And it's a way to symbolically extend your Suda. Part of my mitzvah of Suda is to share it with people. And I can't invite everyone to my table. So I share symbolically. I send you some food, I send you some food. So all of a sudden, the Rambam changes the paradigm by putting it to the same halacha. And by saying v'chein, the bridge word, the Rambam says Mishloach Manos is part of the Chovas Suda. Which leads to our question, what is Mishloach Manos? See the board? Is it a matana, a gift like Matanos Avyonim? Or is it chelek mehasuda? Ayin lashon Rambam. Which means that every time in Shas that you see a Rambam, and as part of halacha X, he puts in Y, then y is a subset of x. Why else would he put it to the same paragraph? Or every time you see the word v'chein in the Rambam or a similar word, and there are probably hundreds of them, kishem, v'chein. I'll give you some other examples, but it'll make the share too long. V'chein is a bridge word. V'chein, kishem. Rabbi Soloveitchik famously said, when you make a bracha on a mitzvah, it's like making a bracha on an apple. Why? Because the Rambam starts in Hilchos Brachos with the halachas brachos of an apple. He says, kishem shemevarchin, halacha gimel, parak aleph, al hana, kach mevarchin l'kol mitzvah mitzvah. It's like you're getting hana from the mitzvah. You have to thank Hashem for that hana. It's like when you get hana from an apple, from some orange juice. So this is our question now. What is the definition of Mishloach Manot? That's called the Chakira, as we've talked about before. And now we're going to look at nafkaminos. Now keep in mind, tonight I'm spoon feeding you because I want you to understand what this is. But real learning is the reverse. I don't give you the idea, I give you the details, and then you have to infer the idea. You have to induce the idea based on the details. Follow? That's the way to learn Shas. Shas is all details. Rishonim, Rambam, Rashba, Ritva, Tosfos, Ramban, Balamor, whatever. Okay, now what can I see from this Balamor about the concept? As I told you in the first shiur, this is a three-step process. Atomize, find the atom, find the Rishon you're talking about, in this case, the Rambam's Lashon. Categorize, turn into a category, something larger. From this Rambam, you see it's part of the Suda. Then globalize. No, now that I know that according to the Rambam, Mishloach Manot is din in Suda, not a din in Matana, what other halachos can I start to see that way? Atomize, find the line in the Rishon you're learning, the line in Tosfos, the line in Rashi, the Machlokas, whatever. Globalize and categorize, turn into larger categories, reflective of something larger. Globalize. Okay? So we're going to talk about 5 nafkaminos tonight. Number 1, what do you send from Mishloach Manot? Number 2, when do you send Mishloach Manot? Number 3, who's chayiv and who's patur Mishloach Manot? Number 4, it's really 4, is what quality? And these are the nafkaminos of every sugi in Shas. What, when, where, who, and how. It's all. And now it's a lot harder because each case is so specific, but what, when, where, who, and how much, whatever. Specific applications. Applications nafkamina is a fancy Gemara word for applications. How do you apply the concepts to details? You're seeing the details. How do you build the concepts from details? But I gave you the details. Okay, so let's start. Number 1, Trumas Hadeshen. What do you send? Trumas Hadeshen, Bishol Isser Lane. Late or mid-15th century, starts in Vienna, gets evicted in 1420. All the Jews were kicked out of Vienna in the pogroms of 1420. These were the last pogroms after the Black Plague. Black Plague ends around 1360. Jews were blamed. Why did you get it as much as the Gentiles got it? Answer is because we showered more frequently than once a year. Their hygiene was horrible. Medieval Western Europeans didn't shower. They didn't have fresh water. So whatever germs they had stuck with them, we went to the mikvah. We washed our hands. We washed for Shabbos. So our hygiene was better. They accused us of polluting the wells. So he was kicked out of Vienna. He moves to Germany, gets kicked out of Germany, makes his way ultimately to Italy. He wrote a sefer called Trumas Hadeshen, which was named Trumas Hadeshen because there were 354 chuvas. Deshen is gematria 354. Shin is 300, Nun is 50, Dalet is 4. Okay, here's a little secret. Most of the chuvos, if not all of them, are made up chuvos. They weren't really asked. Why? Because in those days, it was very, very hard to publish. You needed a lot of money. And you had to get subsidies. And in those days, there was only subsidies for halachas svarim, shelos v'tshuvos. People didn't give subsidies for your parish on Maseches Kiddushin or your parish on Maseches Bava Basra. So you had to make up questions so that you get money to publish the sefer. We know that these are made up questions because there's no names, there's no dates, there's no cities. Normally, when you read a Chassam Sofer, you read another Yehuda, the following question was asked to me, Erev Purim, Tafshin, whatever, Taf Reish, whatever, and Yankel told me about Shpinkel, told me about Rivko, told me about Leah on this. You see a real series of questions. But here, these are made-up questions. For example, oh, I'm so happy you asked me about my shot in Bava Metzia, Daf Chav Gimel. I'm so happy you asked. Here's the answer. They're fabricated questions because they don't sound like real questions. Anyway, so Trumas Hadeshen, a little bit of interest. His wife knew how to learn. So his wife translated one of his chuvos into Yiddish about Nida. So there's a little secret list that only Talmidei Chachamim know about all the svarim that were actually written by women, because many of the men weren't such good writers. So they had their wives or their sisters write for them. When you come to Yeshiva, I'll tell you that list. It's a fascinating list. But anyway, he translated one of the chuvos of his She translated of his husband. So he asked the following question. Sheila, Kufiyat Aleph, B'nei Adam HaSholchim L'Chavreim B'Purim Chalukim. People that send sheets or clothing, B'Sadina, B'Chai Gavna, Yotzim Yedei Mishloach Manot Allah. Let's put it, guys, into 2026 terms. Shia, what would you rather get? Popcorn, Raisinets, Maltesers, Cadbury, whatever? Or an iPhone, a laptop, a pair of running shoes? I don't know. Something really useful. One of Rabbi Taragin's latest svarah. I don't know. Something really valuable. The answer is, of course, you'd rather get that than potato chips and Pringles and more popcorn and more candy. More valuable. Yet, tshuva, yeraya, the ein yotzin bohem. The nera tam de Mishloach Manot, the reason for Mishloach Manot is kedei shehei lekol echad dai v'sapek l'kayim asuda. To help people who mekayim their suda. It's an extension of your suda, sharing your suda. And you got to give food. Alma gabi Mishloach Manot savar dafka mida de michli. It's got to be food, edible. All of a sudden, now this Trumas Hadeshin makes a lot of sense. Trumas Hadeshin, 14th, 15th century, Vienna, Italy, Germany. Oh, it's just like the Rambam, 12th century, Spain, Egypt, Israel. You see, that's the glue of Lumdus. You categorize and you then globalize. You take halachas that seem to have nothing to do with one another, and yet they have everything to do with one another. So I believe that if I get to Shemayim and I track down the Rambam and I say, Rambam, do you have to give food or can you give clothing? He'd say, of course you give food because I believe it's a din in the Suda. So now I can speculate what the Rambam would say about the Trumas Hadeshin's question, even though he didn't talk about the Trumas Hadeshin's question. And that's how you learn Shas. Categories, categories, categories. And when your mind is trained to build those categories, you'd be surprised how meaningful learning Gemara can be. Second question. Let's go back to our Makaros. What type of food? Let's say, like the Trumas Hadeshin, has to be food. The Magen Avram was of Avram Gumbiner. He lived in the 16th century in Poland. He wrote a sefer on Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century. It became such a dominant sefer that everyone started writing Perushim to the Shulchan Aruch. Shach, Taz, Beishmuel, Magen Avram. Magen Avram, when he quotes the halachas of Mishloach Manot, he writes, Shtei Manot, you have to give two types of food. He adds one word. Mivushalim, aroi lachila. Not just edible, like the Trumas Hadeshin, but processed, cooked, baked, smoked, fried. Mivushalim. I'm makbid every year. I give my normal Mishloach Manot, candy, popcorn, whatever. And I give one real Mishloach Manot, one plate of chicken and kugel, chicken and rice, meat to it. I generally try to save it for an ani that comes to the door. So I give him matanos of I say, here's my Mishloach Manot. And I put a spoon there, a fork, a little bread, whatever. Magen Avram. Why would the Magen Avram require cooked food? Anyone? Why cooked food?
It's a meal.
Is it supposed to?
And meals are not just raw vegetables and fruits. Meals, and you prepare for a meal. So maybe the Magen Avram also held like the Rambam. That's why you need cooked food. And now all of a sudden, now that I'm starting to build categories, now all of a sudden I think that in halacha, a meal has to have cooked food. If it's not cooked food, it doesn't count as a meal. Where else in halacha do you need a meal, and therefore you may need cooked food, not raw food that's edible like apples, oranges, cucumbers? Where else in halacha do you need a cooked meal? Anyone?
Yantif.
Excellent. Close here. What happens if you want to cook on Yantif for Shabbos? Let's say Yantif falls on Thursday, Friday, then
Well, Erev
Shabbos.
Tashilin, you need to
Erev
have
Tashilin.
like to cook the
Ah,
egg. Yeah.
Very good. You have to. Erev Tashilin means you start preparing Shabbos before Yantif. You start cooking a symbolic part of the Shabbos meal on Wednesday, and you can continue cooking the Shabbos meal on Erev Shabbos, which is Yantif. You can't start a Shabbos meal on Yantif, you can continue, whatever the logic is. And that's why for Erev Tashilin, you need cooked foods. And that's why we have an egg and matzah, because they're both cooked. You need one baked, one cooked for whatever it's machlokas in the Gemara, Beisham, Beisil, and Beisa. And all of a sudden, you can start thinking you built a category. That category, Yehuda, doesn't just affect how you view Mishloach Manot, it affects how you view Suda in halacha. Let's say, for example, I'm making this up, but I would paskin if someone asked me the kasha. Let's say a person says, I'm making a neder not to have a Suda with Shia, let's just say. Can he sit down for an apple together and eat an apple together? Now, the reason I'm making it up is because Nidarim normally don't follow halachic categories is called Lashon B'nei Adam. Since neder is something that human beings make, you don't follow how halacha defines it. You normally follow how people refer to it. And probably in today's world, a meal would include, apples and oranges, but in halacha may not be true. So all of a sudden, Magen Avraham may be agreeing with the Rambam. And that's our first nafkamina. The first nafkamina is, what do you send? You send begadim or only ochel? And even if it's only ochel, roy lachila or dafka merushal or rafua. So maybe one day, I remember when I was in yeshiva, I went to Makai in this Magen Avraham, and I didn't really have a kitchen. So what I did is I went to the makolet, and I bought a roll, a lachmaniyah, and I bought some deli, and I made a sandwich, and I gave every year to my chavrusa. That was already my mahajin mira mahajin Mishloach Manot, and then everything else was candy and cookies and potato chips and whatever else I was giving. Okay, second nafkamina. When should you give Mishloach Manot? What do you mean, when should you give Mishloach Manot? On Purim. Yeah, but Purim isn't always one day. Let's talk about Purim being on different days. So, for example, the first Mishnah in Megillah talks about the takana the Chachamim made, that if you live in a small town, let's see, who's here from a small town? I don't want to embarrass anyone. You live in a small town somewhere, and you don't have a Baal Kriya to read the Megillah for you on the day of Purim itself, so you live in a kfar. Kfar is a small town. Kfarim makadimim leo maknisa. So the people in the kfarim could read on the Monday or Thursday before Purim. Namely, let's say this year Purim, your dalit is Tuesday. If you live in a small town, you could read it on Monday because everyone traveled into town on Monday and Thursday anyway for shopping, for laundry, things of that sort. Let me just make a bracha because I had a drink. I don't want to forget by the time the shiur is over. Sorry. So you read the Megillah a day early, let's say this year. You don't read on the 14th, you read on the 13th when you're in town. And what about the other mitzvos, Azi of Purim, the other three? Mikra Megillah is a day early. So the Gemara says that Matanas Levyonim we also give a day early, on the day before Purim, the day you read the Megillah, because it's not fair to the poor people who are waiting the whole year to get their tzedakah for Purim. They hear the Megillah and they have to wait a day. It's like teasing them. So Mikra Megillah is a day early, and Matanas Levyonim is a day early. Natan, the Suda, you just make one Purim itself. You're in your small town. Why not make the meal in your small town? There's no reason to make it a day early. So this is our split right now. Okay? Kriyas Megillah, Matanas Levyonim a day early. Suda on the day itself. When would you give Mishloach Manot? If I'd asked you that question 20 minutes ago, what would you have said? Well, just like you give Matanas early, you should give Mishloach Manot early. What does the Ran say? Let's read the Ran. Ran is 14th century Spain, Talmud of the Ritva, was the Talmud of the Rashba, was the Talmud of the HaRav, was the Talmud of the Ramban. What does the Ran say? The Ran says, in the Rif, Afal Pi. We'll see in a second. You give the matanos on a day early. Einam sholchim manos. You don't send manos, mishloach manos in the early day. Why? Shani hasam. You're not going to send manos early to lo avdi suda. You're not making a suda on the early day. Why would you send mishloach manos? Namely, when do you send mishloach manos? On the same day you make a suda. You can't separate them because they're part of one chiyuv. So now it's not just the Trumas Hadeshin and Magen Avraham like the Rambam, but conceivably the Ran. So let's say reverse engineering. If you'd ask the Ran, can you send non-food? He'd say no, because it's part of the Suda. And if you ask the Ran, does it have to be Mvushal? He may say yes. If you ask the Ran, all of a sudden it sounds like we're building a whole camp of Rishonim that hold that it's a din in the Suda, as opposed to those who would say it's a din in Matan. Let's move a little further. What happens if Purim falls on Shabbos? Anyone know the halacha? Well, it can't fall on Shabbos in your dalit, but in Yerushalayim Tesvav can fall on Shabbos. So what do? Anyone know? It's called a Purim Mishulash. The 3-day Purim. You read the Megillah a day early, so it's now you read it on the 14th, which is Erev Shabbos, like the rest of Am Yisrael, right? Yerushalayim is a walled city, so their Purim is Tesvav, but you read the Megillah a day early. On Shabbos, and of course you give Matanos Levyonim the same day, read the Megillah, not to be unfair to the poor people. On Shabbos, you say Al Anisim, you read Kriyas HaTorah Purim, you have Amalek in Parshat B'Shach, Kriyas HaTorah and davening Kriyas HaTorah, no mitzvahs because of Shabbos, no Suda or anything. And then you make the Suda on Sunday. That's the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch. Erev Shabbos, Megillah, Matanos Levyonim. Shabbos, davening Torah, Kriyas HaTorah, davening changes. And then Sunday, you make a Suda and you give Mishloach Manot because you don't want to give Mishloach Manot on Shabbos. That's the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. However, there's an interesting posek called Rabbeinu Levi ibn Chaviv. He's known as the Maharal ibn Chaviv, who was expelled from Spain, like the Beis Yosef. He moved to Eretz Yisrael, like the Beis Yosef, but he moved to Yerushalayim, not to Tzfat, unlike the Beis Yosef. And he became the chief rabbi of Tzfat as a Sephardi, as a Spanish Jew. Now, I say this not like the Beis Yosef because I'm going to tell you a machlokas he has with the Shulchan Aruch in a moment about Purim Suda. But his major machlokas was, should you renew smicha? We lost smicha about 1,700 years ago. The smicha that I have, it's there on my wall. You see it back there on my wall, right over there? The smicha that I have on my wall from Rabbi Soloveitchik is not real smicha. It's basically, it's like, okay, you've learned a lot of Torah, you can now give Torah over in psak. The original smicha was, Moshe putting his hands on Yoshua, and Yoshua putting his hands on the shofar, and that allows you to be able to base in and give capital punishment and malchus and all that stuff. I can't do that. I have real smicha. The Rambam suggests that when we have all the Talmudic Chachamim gathered in Eretz Yisrael, we can renew smicha, even without some divine startup, divine jumper. Don't Tzfat, in the middle of the 16th century, the Talmudic Chachamim said, let's start smicha. And the Beis Yosef Karo was on that beis din that started smicha. And the Maharal Chaviv, Reb Levi ibn Chaviv, was in Yerushalayim, was stridently opposed to it. The big machlokas in Tzfat and Yerushalayim, people in Tzfat wanted to renew smicha, people in Yerushalayim didn't want to. But now we're not talking about that machlokas. Talking about what happens when Purim falls on Shabbos. So the people in Tzfat say when Purim falls on Shabbos, Yerushalayim, push off the Suda to Sunday. Maharal Chaviv said, what do you mean? I'm in Yerushalayim. Why can't we make a meal for Purim on Shabbos? Just double up, Purim and Shabbos. What's the big deal? Have us one Suda, call it Shabbos Purim Suda. So the Maharal Chaviv argued with the Shulchan Aruch and said in Yerushalayim, make the meal on Shabbos. Okay, interesting machlokas. Why don't you make the meal? But here's the second question. According to the Maharal Chaviv, when would you give Mishloach Manot? Of course not on Shabbos, right? So hard. You have to walk around, you have to make a kinyan. How can you give Mishloach Manot on Shabbos? You know what the Maharal Chaviv paskin? Yep. Give it on Shabbos. Could you imagine giving Mishloach Manot on Shabbos? Why? Because you can't separate Mishloach Manot from the Suda. It has to be on the same day you're making a Suda. Now, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you make the Suda on Sunday, no problem. But according to Maharal Chaviv, you're making the Suda on Shabbos, and you got to give Mishloach Manot on Shabbos. Find a way. Go to your neighbor within the Erev. Say you're not making a kinyan, whatever. It's read the Maharal Chaviv because he agrees with the Rambam. The Magen Avraham quotes him. He quotes Maharal Chaviv. The Shulchan Aruch says you don't make a Suda on Shabbos. That's a Shulchan Aruch's psak. You make it on Sunday. The Maharal Chaviv, Herech Berayos, he brought a lot of rayos against the Shulchan Aruch. Shasuda b'Shabbos. You make the Suda on Shabbos. The Asakin Ma'aseh b'Yerushalayim. And you paskin for all of the people in Yerushalayim whenever Purim is on Shabbos, not like the Shulchan Aruch. Make it on Shabbos. The Gam Mishloach Manot b'Shabbos, and also give Mishloach Manot b'Shabbos, ki hamanos hein me'asuda, because the manos are extending your suda. You got to extend it on the same day you're making it. So now all of a sudden we have two questions about when. The Ran, that even though you read the Megillah early if you live in a hamlet or a small village, and you give Matanos Avionim early, you do not give Mishloach Manot early. You make it on the same day as the Suda, 14 in your small town. And what happens when Shabbos is Purim, Purim is Shabbos? Again, we pass on the Shulchan Aruch, you push it all off to Sunday, no problem, makes sense. We're going to Maharal Chaviv, you make the Suda on Shabbos. And you give Mishloach Manot on Shabbos, however you'll do it, however you'll solve the technical problems. Now all of a sudden, there are two questions of when you give it. One is, B'nei Akvarim, what happens if you live in a village? Two is, Purim Mishloach on Shabbos, what happens if it's Purim on Shabbos? Question three. Shulchan Aruch writes, Achas Megillah Purim, Tafresh Tzadikei, V'yesh l'shloach manos bayom v'lo b'layla. Sometimes you have an aunt that comes and visits you Purim night, you see a friend from camp or something, you want to give them a shloach manos, oh great, but you're not yotze. Shloach manos has to be during the day, not at night. Why is that true? Let's look at the Vilna Gaon on his parish in Shulchan Aruch. Anyone want to tell me before we see the Vilna Gaon? Anyone want to tell me why it has to be during the day? What do you think now? Why should Mishloach Manos be according to the day, in the day dafka? Okay?
You mean Mishta V'Simcha?
Because the Suda is during the day, based on the pasuk of Mishta V'Simcha. Exactly what the Vilna Gaon says. The Vilna Gaon says, V'yesh l'shloach, k'mo shekosav, Mishta V'Simcha, Mishloach Manos, v'kaya kula. Refers to everything. 40 minutes ago, you would have just breezed by this Vilna Gaon. It's a nice shop. And now that your eyes are trained, you see what you're looking for. So much of Lumdus is to train your eyes. What am I looking for? What am I trying to find? Oh, now all of a sudden the statement sticks out. Shulchan Aruch and the Vilna Gaon. So now we've discussed two nafkaminas. Each nafkamina has some nafkaminas. One is, what do you send? Food, edible food, prepared food. Two is, when do you send it? 3 questions. What if you make Purim early? And you send Mishloach Manos. What happens if you make Purim one Shabbos? Can you still send Mishloach Manos even though it's hard technically? And should it be only in the day or even at night? Shulchan Aruch paskins only during the day. So fancy word for nafkamina, it's a fancy word for applications. Who, what, when, where, and how. And what you're going to do in yeshiva is I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you all these nafkaminas, and you have to try to build the top. Here, go through the Trumas Hadeshin. What does Trumas Hadeshin show you? Go through the Magen Avraham. What does he show you? Go through the Ram. What is he? What can you learn? How can you take the details and turn them into something larger so you can start seeing Shas not as a detail, but what were the Chachamim Mesakim when Tim Shabbat Manos? What does Hashem say when he told us Kiddushin or Gittin or Kinyan, whatever? That's what Lumdus is, to try to get to the Ratzon Hashem, or try to get to the Ratzon Hashem as it was translated by our Chachamim or Zechron Levrach Chazal. We want to try to get to the Ratzon and not just say, oh, I know this detail, but what was the Chachma? What was the definition? Okay? Okay, let's move to the third question. Third question is, who? Who's Chayiv? The Gemara tells a story. Very often, the Gemara doesn't just give us halachas, but it tells a story of 2 very poor brothers who couldn't afford Mishloach Manos. Could you imagine that? That's how little money they had. Abaye bar Avin, Rav Chanina bar Avin, 2 brothers, Abaye and Rav Chanina, not the famous Abaye, but a different Abaye. Michalfi Seudasayu Ladadi. Not being able to afford Mishloach Manos, they swapped meals. What's the simple reading, anyone? What do? They're swapping meals? Anyone explain it to me? Abaye sent his potatoes and meat to Ravina, and Ravina sent his chicken and rice to Abaye. So they each were Makaya and Mishloach Manos, but they didn't have to spend any money. I was eating chicken and rice anyway. You know what? Natan, I'll give it to you. And you're eating potatoes and meat. You give it to me, so we basically have 1 meal each and no real money expenditures. If that were the case, then what's the chiddush? Why does the Gemara have to tell me something which is obvious? Of course you don't say. Like, the Gemara doesn't give story stop. I'm swapping meals. I give you my rice and chicken. Give me your meat and potatoes. Like, why not? Because of this kasha, Rashi reinterprets it. They weren't swapping meals. Zeh ochel im zeh bepurim shel shana zu, u'v'shniya asari chaver imo. Abaye told Ravina, you come to me this year for Purim Suda. And next year I'll come to you. So large scale, neither had to spend that much money because they had an off year. Abaye said, come eat with me 1 year. And Ravina said, next year I'll come eat with you. That's how Rashi interprets the Gemara. Okay, guys, think hard. There are 2 chidushim in this Gemara. What are the 2 chidushim? What are the 2 chidushim about Mishloach Manos in this Gemara? We can think. If they swapped invitations, 1 year they ate with Abaye, 1 year they ate with Ravina. What do you see the chiddush about Mishloach Manos here?
You can fulfill it by having someone eat at your own meal.
Excellent. We'll get to that in a moment. That's the second chiddush. What's even the bigger chiddush, Donnie?
You could give it for next year.
Say it's stronger.
You don't actually have to give Mishloach Manot. You could give an invitation for next year.
That's what Donnie was saying. But what happened on the year that you were a guest? What happened to your Chiyuv Mishloach Manos? Evidently, put it together, if you were a guest, Chaim,
If you don't do a Suda, you don't need to do Mishloach Manos.
if you're not making a Suda, you don't have to do Mishloach Manos that year. Got it, Donnie? That's a bigger chiddush. If I would have said that to you, 1 second, Chaim, I would have said that to you 40 minutes ago, you would have shut the Zoom. Rav Taragin, you're not be cursed. What do you mean? I'm not making a suit. I have to put on tefillin, I have to take lulav. Where do we get the Torah from? 1 second, Chaim. 1 second. 1 second, just a second. But now it makes sense. 1 second, Chaim, I'll get to your question. It's exactly how the Magen Avram interprets the Gemara. And he passes like that. Venerally, the Misha Ochel al Shulchan Chaver. If you're a guest that year, you're not making a suda of Lohechen Lo Klum. Pater Mishloach Manot. You're Pater Mishloach Manot because he holds like the Rambam. Mishloach Manot means sharing your meal. You're making a meal, nothing to share. The King Muchach Tzas Barashi. You know, like that from Rashi. Gavi Mechalpi Sidasai Ladadi. Mekamakam Tzarachin. He's a little uncomfortable with it. And he ends up saying the Tov L'Hachner. So no one should practice this at home. If you're not making a meal, still give Mishloach Manot. But the possibility, at least what Rashi held, what comes from Rashi, stems from Rashi, sounds like Rashi felt that Mishloach Manot is part of the middle. Dani, I'll get to your nafkamina in a second. So listen, nafkamina. Chaim, what did you want to say?
What about matanos levionim? Why are those not linked the same way?
Chazal
They may
makes
be
sense.
timed differently. They may be timed differently because of either teasing or because of practicality, but why are they not linked to Mishnah the same way?
I don't know why. I can speculate about the why, but I can tell you the why. Evidently, Chazal wanted tzedakah to be a standalone mitzvah having nothing to do with the meal, similar more to tzedakah. There's a whole separate shiur Chaim that I'm not going to give tonight. Is matanos levionim part of the normal mitzvah of tzedakah, or is it a separate mitzvah of tzedakah? Can you change money from one to another? But evidently, we're getting down to the lumdus. Chazal, for whatever reason, we can speculate with the why, but Chazal did not attach matanos levionim to the meal. They attached Mishloach Manot to the meal. Now I know Chazal's takana. Maybe when you ask me why, I'll discuss this a little bit later when I get to the machshava part of the shir. Donnie, getting back to Donnie, what's the second chiddush? Not only is the guest pater in the year he's a guest, but what were you saying, Donnie?
That the host fulfills obligation through hosting him.
You can fulfill your obligation not just by sending, but by inviting. Again, had I told you this 40 minutes ago, you would have laughed at me. Why am I going to this yeshiva where even the rabbi doesn't know me? And now it's obvious, because if the mitzvah is to symbolically share your meal by sending some food over, what's a better way than symbolically sharing your meal by sending a food or dish over? What's a better way of symbolically sharing your meal? Inviting him to your meal, the whole meal. It's obvious, right? It's obvious that Rashi held like the Rambam. Who needs a Trumas Hadesha? Who needs a Magen Avram? It's Rashi in Megillah. And until you train your mind to think like that, you're not going to see these connections. Because Rashi's talking about the story of Abai and Ravin. The Rambam never commented on that. The Rambam's talking about his definition, and Trumas Hadesha is talking about his question, and Magen talking about his question, and they're all talking about different questions. But they're all talking about the same thing. And that's the glue of Lamdas. Taking the details in Shas and making them into concepts. What is Kiddushin? What is Gittin? What is Kinyan? What is Nadara? What is Hektish? What is... And you'd be surprised how quickly you can train your mind to think that way. And then all of Shas changes. Shas becomes this exploration of the Ratzon Hashem. Like, what did Hashem mean when he said this? When he said that? It's a whole different way of seeing it. That's why it's, you must never. What is the emes? What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say? What did Chazal say based on HaKadosh Baruch Hu's system? Okay, I'll just end with one more nafkamina, just to drive it home. Okay, but just to remind you to do some chazara. Okay, we talked about what do you give? Food, edible food. Talked about when you give. Talked about who's chayiv, is a guest chayiv. If you're a host, are you also chayiv, or is your hosting sufficient? Okay, let's go back to our makaros. And we talked about the two poor brothers who didn't have enough money. There's also one of the richest Jews of his time, Yehuda Nasi. He's a very rich Jew, Chaim.
The Gemara in Megillah, would it not seem like they're fulfilling matanos levionim the same way?
And the Gemara doesn't talk about matanos levionim. It's a good question. How do
It doesn't mention Mishloach Manot either. It just says Mechal Fesudei Hadade. Why
Right.
would they not be fulfilling matanos levionim the same way?
It's a good question. The question that you're raising is, can you do both at once? If I send food to a poor person, does it count as once? Does it count as both mitzvahs? But assuming right now it counts as only one. I mean, we're talking about Mishloach Manot. It's a good question. Part of the question is an ani chayiv in matanos levionim? If you're a recipient of tzedakah, an ani's not chayiv in tzedakah. Once you dip beneath the the standard that you call the you're not chayiv tzedakah, you're a recipient. Would that same Torah apply to matanas v'yom, which is what I said before? So matanas v'yom is just part of tzedakah that's intensified on Purim, or it's a separate track, and therefore even poor people will be chayiv. But that comes up in the following case. Some people read the following case the following way. I'll tell you, I'm not going to read it that way. Some people read it. Vidar Nasi was a very rich Jew. Obviously, he was Vidar Nasi. Shadar Leiler of Oshia, Itma de El Glatilsa Bagaber de Chamra. First of all, Rav Oshia was one of the Talmidim of Vidar Nasi. He and Rav Chia, two Talmidim of Vidar Nasi, they collected leftover statements of Chazal that hadn't been canonized as part of the Mishnah. Namely, before Rav Vidar Nasi wrote the Mishnah, there were hundreds of thousands of ideas that had been expressed orally. Yehuda Nasi, in his base matters, sat down and said, let's take, 200,000 and write them in the Mishnah. But there were still hundreds of thousands of ideas that weren't codified in the Mishnah, weren't compiled in the Mishnah. So two of his Talmidim, Rabbi Oshia and Rabbi Chia, said, let's make a second round. They're not as authoritative as the ones that Yehuda Nasi put into the Mishnah, but they're still important enough to record. What do we call that? Anyone know? Danny? Called
A brisa?
Tosefta. Whatever they collect is Tosefta, and then anything else that didn't make it into the Mishnah, didn't make it into Tosefta, is called a brisa. It was left outside. Brisa, it was outside. Levar. And obviously a brisa is not as authoritative as a Tosefta, and a Tosefta is not as authoritative as a Mishnah. So very often a machlokas in the Rambam and Tosfos will be how serious to take a Tosefta. In general, the Ramban took Toseftas more seriously. So Ramban will give his pshas, I found a Tosefta, now I'm going to reverse my tracks and say something differently. So Rabbi Yehuda, who was the Nasi, sent a gift, Chaim, to his Talmud Rav Oshia. You know what he sent him? A rack of lamb, cooked lamb, and it was the third offspring of the mothers. It was very juicy. And garba de chamra, and a big barrel of wine. Let's call $1,000 Mishloach Manot. Rack of lamb, vintage wine. Shalach lei. Rabbi Oshia sent him something back. Okay, now it's not clear what he said back. Chaim, according to our Gemara, it sounds like he sent back, with this you did both. Kiyamta banu rabbeinu Mishloach Manot umatanos, because Rav Moshe was poor, and by sending me food, you did both, double dip. You sent me food, Mishloach Manot, sent me money, matanos aviyah. That's how our Gemara reads. The Ritva has a different girsa. Not in the Gemaras that we have, but the Ritva's Gemara, the girsa was that Rav Moshe sent back, no, I'm poor. I'll take it for matanos aviyah because I'm poor. Money, food, same thing. But you didn't fulfill Mishloach Manot to be there, Nasi. Kiyamta banu rabbeinu matanos aviyah, but Mishloach Manot, start again. Try again. And why in the world, according to the Ritva's girsa, did Rabbi Oshia send back and say, you wouldn't fulfill Mishloach Manot, only matanos aviyah because I'm poor? The Ritva says, perish. Shlohaisa yikar achur be'enav. Rabbi Oshia said it's not expensive enough, even though it's very expensive, objectively. But Amar she'ena matana l'adam kamo. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, it's not the food you're eating. You're sending me lamb and wine, but you're eating steak and, fancier wine. So even though you send me a $1,000 gift, it has to be your level, first class, not a different level, business class, even though objectively it's pretty fancy schmancy. Has to be your level. Eina matana l'adam kamahu. In order to be Makayim Mishloach Manot, you have to send the food, Azi, that you would eat. Not the food that objectively is tasty or expensive. Why in the world would you have to send the food that you would eat? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? Because the Ritva, according to this Girsa, probably held like the Rambam. And you're extending your meal and only things that you would eat, not things. If you're eating Chateaubriand and you're going to send rack of lamb, even though objectively it's very expensive, it's just not your level. And if we want to see you as symbolically sharing your food with others, then it has to be something close to your level. And that's how to explain the Ritva. And without the Rambam and the Ran and the Trumas Hadeshen and the Magen Avram and the Biur Hagon and the Rashi and the Magen Avram, there'll be no way to wrap your head around this Ritva. And it's not the only way to read the Gemara. There are many other ways to read the Sugya. But this Ritva only makes sense if you start holding like the Rambam. And that's our final table. Our final table is Mishloach Manot. Is it a matana? Is it part of the Suda? And we have effectively 6 or 7 nafkaminas, but I've classified them into subgroups. What you give, when you give, who's chayiv to give, and the quality. And that's how you learn the sugya. And then we could start asking ourselves, okay, now that we have defined the mitzvah, now we can start asking it philosophically. Why would Chazal have made it one way? Why would Chazal have made it another way? Why would they have said, okay, just give food gifts having nothing to do with the meal to create happiness and fraternity and friendship and whatever? Or why would they said, you know what, it's nothing to do with gifts. That's Matanot Sevyonim. It has more to do with creating a certain type of a meal. Because in Megillas Esther, those meals, those parties were horrible. They were hedonistic and gluttony and orgies and ostentation and throwing up, and it's horrible. It's moral decadence. It's horrible. And Esther had better meals. She invited 2 people to a meal for a particular purpose. And when we celebrated our triumph, our meals weren't wild and savage. They were selfless and trying to create friendship and joint meals. So Chazal said, have a Purim Suda, but have a Suda the right way. Don't have the Suda that Achashverosh had, with wild drinking and eating and beauty pageants, whatever else, whatever other schmutz went on there. And then you can start thinking about how Chazal were misaking the mitzvah. And then you can start comparing it to other chiyuvei Suda, let's say the Suda on Yom Tov, the Suda on Chanukah, how Chazal were misaking Sudas then. So only by turning those details into something higher can you start thinking about higher ideas, as opposed to just learning he says, he says, he says, he says, and then trying to remember the details. So Lumbus is trying, as I told you the first year, it's atomize, find out the Rambam, the Rashi, the Trumas, like find the Makor you're learning, categorize, turn to a category, and then globalize and start to apply to others, details. And when you're first learning, it's very hard to atomize because you don't really know the sugyas. So the Rebbe's going to say, see this, see this. I've already taught the sugyas. I'll take you through the sugyas. I'll say, first see Rashi. What's the Chiddush in Rashi? First see this line and tell us what's the, I'll do the atomization for you. But the goal is ultimately to be able to open a sugya anywhere and go through those 3 steps and read all the Rishonim and find the key Rishonim and then try to turn them into categories and try to hook them up to others. You'd be surprised how quickly this happens. I know it sounds like a lot, like how in the world would you do this? But when you're immersed and you do it every day and you get really good teachers, which Baruch Hashem we are, then you'd be surprised how quickly. You're not going to write a sefer, but all of a sudden you pick up this derech. And as some people talk about the brisker derech and how we try to teach the brisker derech in yeshiva, that's what they're referring to. Okay, everyone. Now you got some Torah for questions? Okie dokes. Love seeing you guys. If we don't speak beforehand, Purim Samech. I have a wedding next week, so it probably won't be a shiur. I'll see if I can get someone to give a shiur for me. My niece.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Laila tov, everyone. Laila tov.
Yeah.
Laila tov.